Hey, friends, I wanted to follow up on something that I mentioned right before my sermon this past Sunday. I mentioned a movement in New Testament studies called the New Perspective on Paul. And I said that knowing that probably is not something that's on the radar of most Christians. And so I didn't want to include it in the sermon and take up time trying to explain it and sift through it. But I wanted to put it out there in case anyone had encountered it and had questions or wanted to know why it was significant to even mention it when preaching through Galatians. And so, what I want to do in this video is just give a very brief summary of the New Perspective on Paul, some of the merits and benefits of this movement. They don't get everything wrong, but then also try to establish where I think they do get some very fundamental things wrong in terms of their understanding of justification. And so, in addition, I want to mention I'm going to link to some resources in the description of this video. So if you want to study more, you can follow up. There's going to be some articles and videos that you can go watch that will give you a little bit more insight into the New Perspective. But just a very brief summary. The term New Perspective was coined by a New Testament scholar named E.P. Sanders. And the views of the New Perspective were really first put out there in a book that he wrote in 1977 called Paul and Palestinian Judaism. And like most academic books, it didn't really get a wide reading. It didn't gain a lot of traction until into the 90s when some other New Testament scholars began to pick up on the ideas. Actually, probably prior to the 90s, there were other New Testament scholars like James Dunn. And then I would say especially when N.T. Wright, who is a name that might be a little more familiar to you. N.T. Wright is an evangelical Anglican and a very, very brilliant scholar, very persuasive writer and communicator. And N.T. Wright began to put out things in support of what E.P. Sanders had written in Paul and Palestinian Judaism, and really began to kind of give it a little bit more of a wide and popular appeal. And essentially what the New Perspective is arguing is this. They say first century Judaism was not marked as a legalistic religion the way we have typically thought. That they saw a gracious covenant that by which people entered into, and works were obviously a part of operating within that covenant. But they would say the idea of salvation by grace was actually intrinsic to first century Judaism. And so by observing that, which again I'm going to point out in a moment, I think that's not a completely accurate observation. But in that observation, it led them to the conclusion then that in the writings of Paul in particular, you have an apostle who's not addressing a problem of salvation by works or works righteousness. And therefore, when he's talking about justification in places like Galatians or Romans, he's not talking about a vertical reconciling of man to God, but rather he's talking about how people are included in God's covenant people. And so what they do is they say the primary problem that Paul is addressing in these books is the problem of Gentile inclusion and all the complications that surrounded that. That the problem the Jews had was not that they believed in works righteousness, but that they didn't want to expand the people of God to include those who hadn't received the covenants, who hadn't received thousands of years of God's promises, and who had previously been engaged in paganism and idolatry. And so they're arguing that's the fundamental problem that Paul is addressing in books like Galatians and Romans. And therefore, when he's dealing with justification, he's really talking about how one is kind of made right in the community of God's people, not how one is made right with God in terms of relationship to him. So you can see the massive dilemma that creates, because that's not how most of us have understood the New Testament or the central message of books like Galatians or Romans. And so we step back and say, well, is there anything to this? One of the other things that they would say the reason why so many people read this as how one is reconciled to God is because we've essentially laid the assumptions of the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther in particular on top of the text. And so they would say Luther, who we know is a man who lived with a great sense of guilt and desire to know how he could be accepted by God, and therefore pursued the scriptures to understand God's way of salvation. They would say that one of the things that Luther did was he kind of overlaid his sense of angst and guilt on top of the text and then read that into these passages about justification, and the Protestant church has adopted that and kind of carried that tradition on ever since. So let me first of all start by saying what I think is helpful with the new perspective, because they don't get everything wrong. One of the things that they have done a good job of is showing the very complex social dynamics of the early church, which I do think is an area that was probably neglected in earlier New Testament studies, and they've provided a corrective to say we shouldn't begin with this assumption that everything in the text is directly about my personal journey first, right? My personal walk with God. We should begin saying this was written in a particular context. There were particular problems and issues that the New Testament authors are addressing and dealing with in the early church. We need to understand it in its original context and then begin to apply it to our context and to our personal lives. And I think that's very helpful, because there's no doubt that there is a very complex problem in the early church in terms of the relationship between Jews and Gentiles. One of the reasons I wanted to put this video out is because if you've been listening to my sermons, you've heard me highlight that quite a bit. And it's one of the areas where I think some of these new perspective scholars have shed some light and just helped us see how complex that problem was. But I wanted to put this out there also to clarify that even though I want to highlight those things, I'm going to continue to do that through Galatians. It is key to understanding Galatians. Where I don't follow them is in therefore concluding that justification, as Paul defines it, is about how Gentiles find their place in the people of God. Rather, it is about how one is made right with God, and that's central to Paul's concern, right? One of the reasons that Gentile exclusion is so dangerous is because it's sending a false message about the gospel. It's sending a false message about what justification really is. And so while I appreciate a lot of those insights, I think they have really, where they have misunderstood the context is in understanding that the problem of works righteousness really was a problem in first century Judaism. It wasn't, and here's where it gets complicated, it wasn't a problem necessarily in terms of how God had revealed himself to the Jews, right? God did not reveal a works righteousness way of salvation. I mentioned this in the sermon last Sunday, that God's covenant with Abraham was a gracious covenant. It was constituted by his work of redemption. And that even the Mosaic law that Israel was expected to live in and uphold was given after they had been delivered from slavery in Egypt, and it was on the basis of the grace that God had already shown them as his covenant people. And so this is where it gets confusing, because we say, well, if that's how God dealt with his people, and if his mercy is the basis of that covenant, then how is it that first century Jews would begin to think differently? And a lot of it is what we see kind of emerging in the Pharisaical tradition. We see the Pharisees who began to put fences around the law, began to, in a sense, expect more than God himself had expected. And we also see this mentality of trusting in their own righteousness. When you lose an emphasis on God's gracious work in salvation, what you fall back on is always going to be your own works. right? And so we see that in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Jesus addresses it to those who trusted in their own righteousness. And then he tells a parable about a Pharisee who trusted in his own righteousness and was condescending toward this tax collector. So even there you see the social dynamics of works righteousness and how that affects the way someone who's living and operating without understanding of salvation is going to relate to other people. In addition, I think a key verse to help us understand the mentality among first century Jews, and again, this isn't to say it was universal, but to say it was predominant among first century Jews. The place where we see Paul going after that, perhaps more clearly than anywhere else, is what he writes in Romans 9:32. So actually, if you begin looking at 9:31, then you see Paul's addressing this problem of Israel's unbelief, right? And trying to reconcile the fact that they had received all these gracious promises and covenants, and yet they have responded in unbelief. And this is what he says in Romans 9:31 and 32. But Israel, who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. You hear the emphasis there? That they were, even in their living out the law that had given them, they were not to pursue it as a grinded out works righteousness, but to pursue it by faith, right? And the same is true for us. Our obedience is always lived by faith. It's always by trust in God's graciousness, trust in his future grace to us. That's how Israel was called to live. Had they been living that way, had they been thinking that way, then by faith they would have apprehended what God was doing in sending his son as their Messiah. And yet they didn't. They missed it. Why? Because they did not pursue the covenant or the law or any of these things by faith, but as if it were based on works. Even the way Paul words that says this is not the way God intended it to be for them. And yet it is the mindset, the theology they had begun to construct and apply. And that's what Paul's going after. You see it, I think, to some extent in virtually all of his letters, but you especially see it in the books of Romans and Galatians, which again are key books that the New Perspective reinterprets. So it's for that reason, it's because we see these places where Paul is specifically addressing works righteousness and contrasting that with the pursuit of a righteousness that comes by faith. It's for that reason that while I appreciate some of the insights of the New Perspective, I cannot draw the same conclusions, because ultimately the justification that is being proclaimed in the letters of Paul is a justification by faith alone, by grace alone, through faith alone, in the person and work of Christ alone, that reconciles us to God. And so I hope that this is helpful just in clarifying some of the issues. I know that this is not necessarily a video that's going to that will have wide appeal for everyone watching it, but if you've encountered this, I hope not only will you find some help in this video, but you'll follow the links below and learn a little bit more from those who have given a lot of time to studying this in depth.